Okay, should we start? I'll take my watch off, and I have every intention of trying to finish by 9 o'clock this evening. The minutes of the last meeting, which was on the 26th of June, being laid on the table for the last half year. Has anyone any particular issues with those minutes? Right.
I've got one comment, Chairman. The last paragraph under paragraph 9, at the bottom of page 10, it talks about the committee requested to have CITL. I thought we went a good deal further than that. I thought we were actually really concerned about the governance proposals for the property company, and we really wanted to see the detail, particularly the checks and balances. And I think it was a bit more definitive than just having CITL, because I think we really were concerned about this area and wanted to have the opportunity of making comment.
I think you're absolutely right, and it's fortunate that Councillor Martin's just arrived at this point, because I think he vocalised it very well at the last meeting, that the task of this committee was not to in any way dictate or undertake the types of investments that the council would take, but rather would review the checks and balances that the company would operate under. So, yeah, I tend to agree that's not quite the right set of words there. Perhaps we could make an amendment.
Yeah, no problem.
With that amendment, can we agree the minutes?
Yes, yeah.
Thanks very much. Are there any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies from Councillor Jeanette Stennett and Councillor Stuart Stennett, and Councillor Richard Seymour is attending as a substitute.
Jolly good. Declarations of interest by anybody?
Number 4 the meeting,
Well,
Chairman.
I guess I ought to again declare an opportunity interest as I'm a member of the Investment Advisory Board, so I guess since we've got property company, I should do so again.
Thanks very much. Questions from the members of the public?
None received, Chairman.
Okay, then let's crack on straight away with creation of property company detailed matters. It's now 2 minutes past 8.
7 I hope.
2 minutes past 7, thank you. By 2 minutes past 8, I hope we've finished this item. I suspect it's probably going to be the longest one on the agenda. And Mike and I have endeavoured to try and reduce the agenda content so that we can focus more on things that we could add value to. So it's not a particularly long agenda, and this being the first item, I suspect will probably take the longest time. Could I introduce David to perhaps give a...
David Allen over here.
Sorry. I wondered where you were. David, could you perhaps introduce this item?
It'll be a relatively brief introduction, I think. Obviously, the council's made the decision to set up this property company for the kind of reasons that are kind of clear around increasing revenue, etc. But there are a number of matters that have been delegated to the investment board around the kind of detail of its kind of construction and its operation and the governance around it. They're kind of set out in the body of the report, but as you can see there are around 10 of them, and it's the feedback that we're looking for from overall scrutiny tonight is on those delegations so to kind of inform the operation going forward.
Okay, thank you very much. I read this report and I read the pink sheets with great interest over the weekend. And I've got to say I was a little disappointed because I perhaps didn't feel that it addressed the points that we talked about at the last meeting, which were the sort of checks and balances that such a company would need to follow. I did a little work over the weekend, and I hope you all received my email. I tried to put a sort of for and against. I'm sorry, David, I didn't copy it to you. copied it to Graham. I think it was late on a Saturday night or Sunday morning when I was doing it. But I presented what's appeared in the press in terms of the risks associated with this type of venture, and also some work that had been done by another council to evaluate those risks and to put something in place which might mitigate them. So I open it to the floor. I should say one thing. I have invited John Gray to attend this evening as chairman of the audit committee. I know he's got a particular interest in this subject. I also think it's very important that we work together on these things. John, for this evening, feel like a member of the committee. If you want to speak, put your hand up. If you want to make a point, just make it.
Thank you, Chairman. Could I propose that the chairman of the audit committee be a permanent member of this committee, because so many of the issues that we get involved in are the remit of the audit committee as well. So it makes sense that perhaps he should be a permanent member of this committee.
It's a good point. I have no issue with John attending the meetings. I think it's probably better than, rather than being a formal member of the committee, he comes along, looks at the agenda, sees if there is a point of interest, phones me up and comes along.
I'm happy with that arrangement, and make it very clear, John invited me and brought it to my attention, the item on here, because he knows of my interest. So thank you very much. It's very much appreciated, and I think we can see how it goes along.
That's the correct way forward, in my view. We can't change membership of the committee mid-year. It's a resolution of full council next March, April, May will be next change next.
Thanks, Peter. So coming to the specifics of the papers that are in front of you this evening. Points.
Well, I mean, you want me to speak?
Please.
Well, I mean, I accept what David says, that the report does what it says on the tin, but I don't think it's what we were looking for, from my perspective. And go back to my comment on the minutes of the meeting. We were concerned last time, particularly, to see, I felt, that the details of the governance arrangements and what detail checks and balances were put in, what levels of authorisation were going to be given to individuals and the rest of it. And that's what I was looking to see in this report. I mean, I understand what's here, but it doesn't seem to do that. And I think this was the area of the property company which was giving us concern around this table last time round. And certainly personally, Chairman, I feel, well, I acknowledge what is here and I can understand what is here, and I welcome the detail in the background and the information from on the pink pages, but I do think we still need to go into see in more detail what are the detailed governance arrangements for the property company, and what are the proposed checks and balances, what are the levels of authorisation that are going to be introduced, and to be able to make comment on those before it goes to the next stage. So I think somehow or other, Chairman, we need to find a way of members of this committee and maybe even the audit committee as well, working together with officers to tease this out. I think it's something that perhaps a small group could get together and help tease this out and get this onto the table in a form that the whole committee can then consider in more detail next time round. Because I think it really is important before we, if we go to council with the real structure of the property company, the detailed governance arrangements seem to me to be an absolutely essential part of what we give the council members give council approval for, and that needs to be out in the open. And for example, when we did the housing delivery board, I remember for one stage we actually produced a flowchart of who could do what to whom and for what level of authorisation. And once that was kicked around and discussed and dealt with, it was actually taken to council for approval, and it's on the statute as to what council agrees should happen. That's just one of the items I think we should be looking at in this particular area.
Thanks very much, Mark. Stephen.
Thank you, Chairman. I actually almost slightly surprised with the way I read the second paragraph of Summary and Purpose is that this was acknowledging that this extra step had yet to be taken, and the pink papers were the first bit of advice which would be needed. And it's an interesting piece of advice. It's very detailed in certain areas, and it throws up three significant issues, which I think do need to be bottomed out. The first is exactly how the governance will be split between the company and the council, because it makes it very clear that the council in fact has certain advantages in dealing. It's a more tax efficient method. It's basically slower, but nonetheless there are certain things like dealing with our own portfolio where it would seem strange and inefficient to use the company because we're not under the same time constraints, which is the principal advantage of the company, as we're told. And as part of that governance issue is the shadow director problem. One of the issues which would always concern anyone, I think, on the council is to be hauled up by some interested member of the public, with or without an axe to grind, on the grounds of illegality. And if the company does something which it can do but the council can't, but it appears that the strings were pulled by the council, perhaps through the same group of people, then it seemed to me that a troublemaker would have ample grounds for instructing council. So we've got to be very clear about how we're going to separate the two governance roles. And the other thing which appeals to my mathematical mind, and I think to the Chairman of the Audit Committee as well, the advice tells us just how many extra costs that are involved if you're using the company. One of the most important checks and balances is for there to be a detailed and accurate spreadsheet model showing how all these costs are taken into account before the after-tax return on a company investment is arrived at. I saw the workings for the first ones that came before council and was not over-impressed because they left out certain important things, quite apart from calculating yields in two quite different ways. So we've got to be extremely accurate and meticulous in how we work out returns, because fundamentally we're telling the council if we find an investment which meets the quality criteria and delivers X% above the long-term cash rate, 2 being the current target for the first 5 years, then it would be a good thing to do. Well, woe betide us if it turns out that rate is not 2 but 1.8 or 1.6 once all costs have been taken into account. And to give you one example, certainly looking at the Seven Oaks example, there will be costs, I imagine, a few tens of thousands per annum in actually having a company. Well, depending how many property transactions you get through, that will have to be spread across the income from those investments, and that has to be taken into account in working out what your return is. Otherwise, you're simply misleading the council. So I think Mike and I agree. I was actually expecting this to be stage 1 of another stage 2 or so before we're anywhere near ready to say quite how this will work. I have other points, but I'm quite happy to leave it there for the moment.
I think the points that you make, Stephen, the 3 points are 3 that Mike would probably suggest are looked at in that risk area and are identified as risk, quantified, and set against the sort of mitigation measures that you might have to put in place.
Actually, the advice was a bit confusing in the area where it identified the split governance and shadow director risk, and then almost seemed to suggest that you could still have the same people in charge of the decisions. And I'd like someone to go back to them, perhaps that's Daniel's job, and ask them to be clear exactly what they're saying there. If you look at the Seven Oaks model, they seem to be quite content somehow with the same people being involved. And I frankly found it confusing.
They had different solicitors advising them.
Well, that's why the legal profession does so well.
Peter, did you have a point?
Not yet.
No.
Sorry, I'm just playing with my pen. So.
I was going to say, that as this company is being set up with public funds, it should be set up in accordance with the law. And the law requires all companies being set up registered with Companies House, and an agent should be appointed who is on the list of agents supplied by Companies House effective 31st of July 2017 to ensure that the company is properly registered. It should have an incorporation, a name, it should have memorandums of association, it should have details of the composition of the board, it should have a share capital, and above all it should have a business plan. And I think we must comply with the law and make sure that this is set up properly. And the other point I had to make is that, as you know, the housing market at the moment is in decline. 80% of houses sold in the month of July were sold below the asking price. And just coming here this evening, I passed 8 for sale sign. And mortgage companies are competing for funds. I gather from the Sunday Times it's possible now to acquire a mortgage at 1%. Everybody's bringing their rates down. So I don't think we should be limited to borrowing from the Public Works Loan Board, but the company should have the right to seek the lowest rate in the market available at that time.
Okay, that's a good point. I mean, your point on the housing market, or the property market in general, is a very good one, and we discussed it last time. Mike and I were speaking about it earlier, and I read some articles on the sort of Grosvenor House, or the Grosvenor Estate portfolio and what they've been doing over the last 3 years, and they've basically been selling on the rising market. Their investment with that money that they've achieved, and obviously paid the Duke of Westminster is due, but having done that, they have invested that money in new build property for the rental market, where they'll have the asset and a rental stream as a result of it. I think we should look what the clever money is doing at the moment, and not necessarily follow the herd. And I do think there is a bit of a herd mentality on this. John.
Thank you very much, John, for letting me come in. Just a general point, really carry over from the audit committee. I think there was a word of caution was coming round, and certainly members said caution. And I'm not going to talk about the general risk of the property company, because tonight we're really looking at governance. But I thought it was very good looking at one of the commentators on it said, for the past 2 years, seeing a wall of money flowing into the Western European property markets, this does increase the risk of a reversal at some point. Tough times in previous property cycles have tended to be characterised by too much capital flooding in and out of the market. I think it's a word of caution there. I think the other thing that's a word of caution is, yes, there are a lot of people are basically moving over their portfolios. They're moving out of more expensive older properties, and they're looking to set themselves up with more attractive new properties. And we've got to be careful we don't end up actually being in there and buying someone else's offload, which would be a tendency. And I think, generally, I personally think it's a good idea to look at this, but we've got to look at the cycle we're in, and we have to be very cautious, and we really need to develop our own, what I would call our own USB. And what is our real skills and knowledge? It's of the Waverley market. It's also of the Waverley market and surrounding it, and we should have, I think, a focus on that. When we're coming to the paper itself, I thought it covered, the advice was particularly good, even better that it coincided with a lot of the advice in Sevenoaks, so you felt that there was a balance in there. I thought in places, though, it sort of said, well, you can do this, you can do that, and you've got to watch various bits. The one thing that came out of it was governance and transparency. It's interesting that one of the paper's articles, the Treasury spokesman came up and commented on our local authorities spending too much money in basically, and borrowing too much to invest in the commercial property. And he said, responsibility for local authority spending and borrowing decision lies with the locally elected councillors, who are democratically accountable to their electorate. And I think that's one thing that's behind me in terms of looking at here tonight is, what do we need to do for the electorate and what do we need to do for ourselves? And I think that paper was good in part, but it left me with quite a few questions. As I understand it, going back to the setup of the IAB was established to advise the executives who would basically make the decisions. Now that we've got this proposal, it creates a subcommittee of the executive which will actually act as a shareholder. So we're delegating to the subcommittee of the authority to act as the shareholder of this company, and they will manage it through a shareholder agreement, through the company articles, and through other rules, regs, including adopting the IAB's lending criteria. I think it was a bit confusing to me as whether the new property board had authority in its own right to go out and invest without actually reference to the IAB or to the executive. That would be implied by some of the comments that were made in there. And I think that's something I would want to basically looked at. I think also the thing that's missing for me is a business plan. It's very important. I mean, I've been in my working life involved with very many noughts, right? And at one time I had a job that involved collecting £1 million an hour. Big noughts are not really something that needs to frighten you, but if you don't have a good understanding of the model that you're using, and I use the word model, I'm not talking which properties, I'm not asking you to identify the point that was made earlier. What's the profile of a company, of an authority-owned property versus a property company? And if the gating is higher for the property company, then will those returns be there? We've talked about returns as low as 2% and sub 2%. That would not be possible, right, in terms of the company if we start adding taxes and other things on. And I think it's very important for certainly members of this committee and members of the audit committee that we have a modelled business plan with milestones. Whenever you take on a massive project, it's important to know you're hitting your milestones. You don't want to wait till the end of the road. You want to say, the first step is to set up the company. This is going to cost us no more than 25,000, and that's the first step. The second step is that we've got £2 million agreed and £1 million maximum property, which was delegated and funded in there. Let's put that to one side. Now, what's the plans and when are you going to add to that? Are you, in your first phase of development, are you going to borrow 5 million and spend that? Or are you basically going to go along, as I think Jed implied to the committee, is, well, if we see a good opportunity, we'll just come up and borrow the money and buy it. That makes me a bit nervous. I don't see there's anything wrong in actually putting up a business plan, making some assumptions, and you know what, it'd be a miracle if the actual follows the assumptions, but at least it gives you something to base your questions on. Why? Why did you do that? Why did you consider that? Your plan was this. Great, if we've got answers to that, we'll all be happy and tick. So I think there are a lot of good examples of very successful commercially property folios. I don't doubt that. I do think we're a little late. I think we've got to be a little cautious. I think my requirements are, one, is a business plan, a model business plan, with milestones. So, for instance, we're going to have a big review and a stop when we've spent £5 million. Right? We're going to actually understand. I think we actually should understand it in terms of when we spent the 2 million that we actually have got already. But there should be milestones, and then to the next stage. I'm uncertain on the decision flow. We've got the council, we've got the executives, we've got the IAB, we've got the subcommittee, we've got the board. The points I think that Mike made about the housing association and actually doing a flow diagram would help, I think would help me, and it would also help me to know that, with respect, our officers actually understand the process they're going down, and not necessarily making it up as they go along, which I know officers don't, but it does get, it does help us to have that common language. I think the target properties should be confined to something we understand. And if we go beyond that, I would like to see a higher gating process. And I mean, I'd be very interested in Peter Martin's comments on this, because Surrey's gone through a lot of this. But we are very small. You know, this is big league stuff. I mean, I have been with big league stuff in my life at Allington Properties and others. We're a minnow. So let's not try and put above our weight. We do need to get some form of USP in terms of what it is we're doing and where we're trying to go. I think also that I'm a little concerned the IAB is the Investment Advisory Board is a bit constrained. I think it should at least have 2 non-executive members on it, and I think it should be from a broad church, and I think at least one of them should be in the gift either of the council or a committee like this. So I think we should have some form of independence on it. That's my summary. I have some points which are really came out of the audit, but they're on risk, and I've certainly echoed Stephen's point about the different costs involved in here and how we're modelling. Things like, I know from my experience, void periods, rent-free periods on relets. We will not get 10 years income for 10 years worth of periods of time. There's also things probably to deteriorate. You know, what's the allowance going to be for repairs? And if you don't repair them, then you don't keep your value up, and then you get an impairment cost, and you come down. So we need to look at it. That's one of the reasons I'd like to see. I'd like to see some form of modelling, some form of business plan on this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, John. Peter.
Thank you. I think the first thing I'd like to say is that as a committee, I would like to see us at least agree the principle of what's proposed here. I mean, to borrow cheap and to invest to get a return, I think is a perfectly sound proposition. So that's number one. Number two, then of course we're going to get into the detail. And I agree, there's a lot here which is good, and there's a lot which I think needs to be clarified. My thoughts. Firstly, I just presume that the mechanics of setting up a company will be done correctly by our solicitor and others. I mean, I just take that for granted, and if I can't take that for granted, I think we're in a pretty sad place. But certainly as it goes on, we might want to just satisfy ourselves that that is the case. And I think thus far our House solicitor has been outstanding in what he's done over the last year or so. So I've not got to worry in that regard. When we want to set up an investment committee, fine, I think that makes perfect sense. And it makes perfect sense to set up a company because there are advantages from setting up a company. So that I don't have a problem with. And all that goes, that is fine. I then run into a bit of a problem with Councillor Gray because I'm a bit suspicious about trying to set up a business plan with milestones and the amounts of money and by when and so on and so forth, because I've got a little bit of sympathy with Jed Hall saying, well, if the right thing comes up, then and it passes the right investment approach and the returns analysis, then you'd want to go for it. And you don't know when those opportunities are going to come up. So you certainly wouldn't want to allocate a pot of money, 5 billion in 9 months or something, and they say, gosh, you haven't met the 5 billion in 9 months, you've got to get on with it. Because that's not the right approach. It may be that in the first 9 months you spend absolutely nothing because the right investment hasn't come up. In terms of the sorts of decisions that will need to be taken, I think on page 18 in section C, they're talking about the scope of activity and the types of investments, and at the bottom of the page, third paragraph, investments shouldn't be restricted by sector or location, seeking the best opportunities, strong covenants, suitable lease terms, balanced portfolio. Those are all the words that I would want to hear. And of course the key thing is that you want balance. You don't want to put all your money into housing locally. You wouldn't want to put it all into some commercial office like Spelthorne have done, for instance, borrowing £300-400 million and investing the whole thing in one building, albeit owned by a fairly decent company called BP, although they've hit hard times. Would you want to do that? That doesn't seem right to me. So you know, I think what we're looking for is a balance, and over time, of course, because you can't get a balance in the first 6 or 9 months, or maybe in the first 2 or 3 years, because it takes a while to achieve the balance that you're looking for. And I would expect what's missing here is the returns analysis. You know, what is the expected investment cost if you're going to borrow at 2.2% from the Public Works Loan Board for 30 years, which is doable. Then what's the investment rate you're going to get, and what will be the net after taking account of the borrowing costs, and of course you've got to take account of the costs of creating, running the property company, and so on and so forth. Then I would expect to see in each of the investment opportunities some options analysis. Certainly that's what we do at the County Council. You know, you say, okay, here is a proposition, and here are the various options that we would expect that we're seeing. You know, we've got 15 years of rent coming from one customer. What happens after that? If we invest, what's the void going to be? We'll assume a void of 12 months. We'll assume there a period of free rent for another 12 months or something of that sort. So I think the business plan needs to come less in terms of saying this is how much we're going to spend and so on and so forth. The business plan almost needs to be focused on how are you going to analyse each of those propositions, and you know what are going to be your what's the technique of demonstrating the returns and considering the risks and considering various options. That's the bit that I think is the weakest in this. It's missing altogether as far as I can see, although there are bits and pieces of references to it, and then there's Annex 2, which is a criteria. You know, some of the things are good. If you look at Annex 2, page 33, some of the questions are answered, price and return, and so on and so forth. So it seems to me maybe a bit more meat on the bone in Annex 2 might be some worth some consideration. As I say, particularly with some sort of, you know, maybe we should take an example of a potential investment and see how we would treat it. You know, what would be the options that you'd put in, what would be the criteria that you'd apply. Maybe a worked example might be the way in which we would better understand where we're going to. I think, Chairman, that's all I want to say for the moment.
Thanks very much, Peter. John, let's go back.
Let's go back. I mean, my comments on the business plan was very much to give comfort to the very points that Peter was raising. And I think it's seeing what the models are, what the things are. Yes, I understand what you're saying about, you know, milestones and 5 million. I mean, I think we set ourselves a target and a plan to spend 9 million in capital this year, and we've spent 4.5 million. Well, I mean, we didn't push to spend the rest just because we had a plan, but we have a responsibility understanding why. What is it? Is the market change? It's a way of communicating. It's a way of people like ourselves asking questions. And I'm not suggesting that this can be a large. There are people, Peter, like yourself, who are very well versed in this subject. There are a lot of people around the chamber who are quite concerned about this project, and I think we owe it to them to give them some form of structure which makes it easier for them to understand. It also, I think that it's a bit like doing a desk exercise. If you haven't done this modelling exercise, you're not sure you've asked all the right questions.
Okay, thank
Chairman,
you.
I do accept that, but I think we're nearer than we think. And I think, but it is important that we carry the council with us, and that they're convinced that this is the right approach. But I do think that in an area of this sort, decisions can't be taken by an entire council. You know, if you're going to succeed in these sorts of investments, unless you start calling emergency meetings every 24 hours during the course of a negotiation, you're going to be a bit snooty.
Peter, I agree with most of the things that you said, not all of them, but most of them. And maybe I should say I am quite a supporter of having a property company. I think it could be quite a valuable tool in our little bag of capabilities. But let me just paint a little picture for you, a hypothetical situation. Suppose we're 4 or 5 years down track with this property company, and there hasn't been a recession. You know, Brexit went really well. The country's done incredibly well. and we have over that 5 years upped our investment and our borrowings to, I don't know, 250 million, which we could do, generating is 6%, 16, 17 million pounds a year. And as you said, I think you said, borrow cheap and earn a margin. What can be wrong with that? And nothing's wrong with that. The essence of business, that's what we want to do. Borrow cheap, earn some money. But in 5 years' time, there's a major depression. People stop shopping, asset values go down, your 250 million is worth 125 million on your books, but more importantly, the 60 million that you were using as income to fund your services as an integral part of your budget absolutely disappears. It goes out the window. You've got an asset which is worth not a lot. You've got an income, you're paying money back to the government, and you've got an income which has gone down, and it means that you can't supply your services. Now, that is the sort of situation that we should put checks and balances in place to ensure that we don't get into, because there's no such thing as free money. It just doesn't exist. There is no such thing as a sure thing. And there's too many people sort of jumping into this. Peter, Stephen, you want to come?
Just a few points of occurred to me listening to others. One thing I didn't mention in my first remarks is that I am confused about the extent of the state aid point, because some of the advice indicates that you can't actually pass on the PWLB special rates to this company, and if that's true, then why would you not make sure it's funded entirely commercially, if that's in effect the rate you've got to charge them, whereas the benefit. The second point is, I'm glad it was mentioned by John and Peter, details like assumptions about voids and rent-free periods and other things have to be brought into the model, otherwise you're just kidding yourself. Accept the chairman's gloomy view about what could happen with property in one respect. He's absolutely right. The big difference between property and other asset classes is that it's illiquid. You can't sell it if no one wants to buy it. And as also mentioned, the maintenance costs and the upkeep costs will still have to be paid. Indeed, the most ironic thing would be you still have to keep paying council tax to someone, even if you can't let it. The third thing which hasn't been mentioned, but I think comes out of the 7X thing, the company must be supported by at least 2 non-executives who are both property professionals. You're going to find someone probably nearing retirement who's prepared to give their expertise for the pittance that we can actually afford to pay them. Because the most worrying thing about all this, and I was close enough to commercial property as chairman of a commercial property company to realise that it's like every other asset class, full of its own traps and tricks, and if you don't understand it, you're simply like the lamb and the wolf sitting down to dinner, and you can guess who's going to be the meal. The last thing is, I agree with that a balanced portfolio. It's one of these comfortable words you always like to see, but what does it actually mean? The one thing I wasn't keen on was the idea of going national. Property is very local. We do know a bit about what's happening in our corner of Surrey. We know a bit about what's happening in the rest of Surrey. The further off we go, unless our non-executives happen to be experts in different parts of the country, we're going to be treading in very much more uncertain waters. And so the fact that the suggestion we would perhaps invest nationally appeared in this report made me worry that the people writing it weren't being quite as realistic as I'd like. But it will not cost an awful lot to get this thing set up and to have it so we can take advantage where it makes sense. But it would be very good to have proper modelling done on a sort of example basis to see how we could actually use this thing to do a better job than the council could. And I fully accept the council, you can't call special council meetings every 15 minutes. But really the only advantage the company seems to offer is the greater speed of movement. And while that can be important, it's certainly true that in what appears to be a slightly declining market, I don't think we need to hurry particularly to get this thing set up. If the big estates are working out now is the time to be a buyer rather than a seller, I think we can afford to take the same view and move slowly into a position where we can actually behave like them if we think it right in perhaps 2 or 3 years' time even.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Very good points. I'm glad you raised the independent, the non-executive directors on the board of the company. I think that's absolutely fundamental. People with competence.
In the
Yeah, absolute competence in the area. In the Seven Oaks thing, I mean, I did attach the job descriptions that the people that they were looking for. I tried to track them down but couldn't find them. But it would add value to the council. Having those people on your books would be an absolute positive in other areas. It's absolutely essential. And the other thing is about having a private company. I mean, a private company works because the directors have have a knowledge, but B, have an ownership and a responsibility in the functioning of that activity. What worries me a little about this and the sort of shadow directors and reporting into the executive is that you remove the one element which makes a company work. If those directors don't feel they've got that responsibility, then you're losing so much of which makes the value of this company.
Thank you for allowing me to come back, Chairman. Before this meeting, I had a long talk with David Harper, who was on Surrey County Council and one of the officers responsible for setting up their company. He said the major costs are the repayment of the loan. Any loan that we take out has to be repaid, and so a 25-year loan would have to be repaid at 4% per year. 4% is a considerable cost. So Surrey have managed to renegotiate their loan portfolio so it goes out for 50 years, so therefore halving the repayment cost. Their portfolio now stands at £3 billion, which their average return is 1%. They're getting 30 million a year from the 3 billion portfolio. So I think we've got to be cautious on trying to ascertain that we're going to make huge returns out of this company. I don't think we will. There's quite a lot of overheads to be taken. The second point I'd like to raise is on page 19, under the Housing Revenue Account, section D. It says here the company should be permitted to undertake transactions that involve housing assets. The report by DAC Beechcroft, the lawyers, say on the last bullet point, under summary, our view is it would not be lawful or appropriate to use housing revenue funds or borrowing against HRA headroom to finance the acquisition of property assets for the purpose of selling those assets to the company.
Yeah, we are being webcast, so I wouldn't go off read things off the pages. Sorry, Richard, you want to come in?
Yes, if I may. I think the high level things that worry me have been addressed. Mike pointed out let me switch over, I'll come back. There's the need for a business plan, I think. I find that important. In spite of Peter's comment, a good degree of flexibility is desirable. I think Annex 2, which was a list of investment criteria, was remarkably vague, and that should underpin a business plan. And so I have concerns about the point that was made about borrowing nationally. I mean, the annex doesn't even state that, it just says borrow in good places, so I think a bit of clarity around that. There are 2 points points of detail that I think would be good to get teased out as we move on to the next stage, which is what I was trying to say, that what Mike said, expecting more detail at this stage, I think. First one is on item C on page 18. It states the company would operate where there's a need to respond more quickly and effectively to market conditions than the council can. So nimbleness is clearly a very desirable thing, as long as this transfer of purchasing entity is not used to circumvent control. I'd be interested to know if we were to go through this exercise on the grounds of being able to get hold of something quickly,
does the asset then have to remain with the property company, or is there the possibility to actually transfer it back into the portfolio of the council to optimise the tax position? Because it looks like commercial property is almost always going to be more tax advantageous in the hands of the council. So I'm not necessarily expecting an answer now, but I think it's something to think about. You know, you get the benefits of having the property company to move quickly, but then, you know, it's an asset. Can the asset be transferred into a position where it can earn a better return because of the tax benefits that the council has? So that's the first point. You know, there'll be costs to that. I'm sure we'd end up having to pay to lots of SDLT, you know, the taxes that go with a transaction. But equally, you avoid the corporation tax. So something to think about there, which I think ought to be addressed and covered as we go forward. And the second point was one around on lending. You know, the point's made that we have to make any loans in a commercial market. Who actually sets that, and is there an opportunity, or are there any problems arising in setting those rates? So, for instance, you've got to repatriate revenues from the property company to the council for the benefit of the shareholder. If the rate were to, of the loan were to go up, are you repatriating funds quicker? Again, that's just an open question, but it's not addressed. There's just this open statement that we have to worry about letting it at a commercial rate. There's no flesh on that, so I'd be very interested to see.
I'm not going to seek answers to these specific questions, because I think all these questions form part of you know, of the overall evaluation which will be done. Peter, just before you, I am conscious of the time. It's now 7:45. I think after your comment, what we'll try and do is see what we can do to move forwards on it.
Okay. Just can I answer one or two points that have been made? Firstly, from Nick here, the amount of money that Surrey County Council has invested is in the 300 to 400 million thus far in its property company. And absolutely not. That 3 billion might be an aspiration at some point in the future, but we certainly haven't invested 3 billion as yet. Or at least if Surrey County Council has done it, escaped my notice, and I've been a deputy during the chairman for a while. I didn't think it would have done. And in terms of getting a margin of 1%, well, yes, if you apply all the contingencies and all the worst case positions that you can, you look at a very low position, and then you hope you're going to do better. But what you want to ensure is that you've really got a low point. And of course, any capital gain is not part of the proposition, but of course over the long term, we all know that in time, buildings do appreciate. Now, of course, we know that there are also times when they go the other way. So I think there are a few points that we've got to be careful about when we quote other councils. Just in terms of this balanced portfolio, and I accept everything entirely what my learned friend across here has to say, who has a great deal of experience in the market here. But certainly at the county council level, we look for a very balanced portfolio. We look for very long leases with the properties that we've acquired. We look for commercial, we look for retail, we look for housing, we look for a whole series of things in different parts of the country. I do think that we must be careful not simply to say, oh, it's only Waverley, or even that it's only Surrey. You know, what happens if you want to go to North East Hampshire, or what happens if you just live across the border into Kent, or you know, a little way away, or even perhaps into London. So you know, you want to be careful to see. I don't think we should be limiting ourselves. We need to maintain some flexibility. But in terms of the portfolio, we need to ensure that over time you do have long lease periods, and then you want to set things up so that, you know, lease periods in this property is coming to an end here, and then 3 years later in something else, 3 years later something else. So that what you don't want is everything all, you know, lease periods all ending in 1 year, which just happens to be in the middle of the, you know, the worst depression in 20 years. You know? So I mean, those are, I guess, those are the sorts of things that we should be specifying as to what we want in terms of our criteria for investment. So that's why I come back to a good worked example, or two or three, in which you kind of incorporate some of the thoughts that I've just had in terms of how you eliminate risk and get the best balance that you can. consistent with the best sort of governance that we can suggest. In terms of an external people coming in, I suspect we'd have to pay peanuts. They'd have to be pretty much volunteers, because if we were to pay them a market rate, it may destroy the thing. On the other hand, what's an expert worth in terms of trying to get this right? And if we were not to pay an expert, then we might make decision mistakes and so on and so forth. So there is a balance somewhere to be struck. But I think we're nearing some reasonable
Okay,
thoughts.
thanks very much, Peter. Before we move on to try and work out what to do next, let me just ask then, in generalities, I mean, I don't want to address too many of the specific points, otherwise we'll be here all evening.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to. Clearly, there are questions, Richard's questions, which we need to take away and think about in detail. But there are some things that I can pick up, because actually I think this discussion's been really helpful, and is actually what David Grove and I had in mind when we discussed the report that was then put together. No, not acknowledging that it's probably not what you're expecting to see now, but that will come. But I think getting a picture of the thoughts that you have as a committee and the directions that you may want to go in is very, very helpful. But I do want to pick up some things. I mean, Councillor Muller, for example, you know, the split of directors and you know, the twin hats and so on. Some advice says don't have officers in the same position, officers you know, taking up those positions. Other advice will tell you you can. Every authority does it a different way. Even within Surrey, you've got some people with councillors on their boards, some without councillors on their boards, some with officers on their boards, some with non-execs, others with no non-execs. So it's really a matter for the council through this process to decide what it feels is best. And you know, when we first suggested the executive director point for the report at the last meeting, I know that was received particularly well, and now we're hearing that you know, maybe two would be a good thing. How they would mean Richard's specific question. The other thing that we had in mind when putting together the report was clearly this committee is the value for money overview and scrutiny committee. What is it that the council wants to get out of this company in terms of value for money? And I've heard that comment made in a way tonight. Is what is our unique selling point as an investor, but also what do we want to get out, and what are we looking to invest in and then deliver with that investment? So I think that was a question that was quite key in Graham's mind when putting the report together. But I think there's a debate over whether you have a business plan up front or whether you have your individual appraisals of each investment, mixture of the two. Reigate, for example, they have individual appraisals. I haven't looked specifically whether they have a business plan, but you know, what's the right balance? And this is where this discussion needs to happen, and at the investment board as well, because I think you said at the beginning about you know, the need for this committee to support officers in preparing this plan. It's also to support the investment board, because when those articles of association and those other things start to take shape, it's this stuff which is really helpful for that work. I think that's probably all I want to say, which is really, yeah, we can take away some of the specific questions, but really this is actually really, really helpful for us as officers.
No, your comments are very useful as well, Daniel. And in fact, thinking about how we could sort of take it forwards and what value this committee could add. I mean, Mike suggested at the start the possibility of perhaps having a small working group that could assess some of these criteria and pick up some of the points that have been made this evening, and to check the risk together with the officers and have a small working group. I mean, I quite like the Seven Oaks analysis that they did. I didn't agree with it, but I quite like the systematic way in which they had approached it. And I think that would be quite a good scrutiny activity, because you would need some challenge on those risk assessments. Mike, any thoughts?
No, I think, you know, in terms of value for money, I think the thing from my perspective we're looking for from that is that we can have confidence in a proposal going forward ultimately to council that there are in place the reasonable checks and balances to satisfy ourselves that undue risks are not actually going to be, we're not going to be exposing the council to undue risks, recognising that we're in a risk business here. And it is slightly different to the normal run of council business historically. And I think from that perspective, we do want, as a committee, I would suggest, to see the proposals coming forward for managing those risks and the checks and balances which are there. So when it actually comes to council, we can be satisfied that we are likely to take all members with us, thinking that this is a good value for money thing. We're here on behalf of the members. So I think there's work to do, but I think some of it is actually in presentation as to what do you expect members will want to see, and are we actually bringing those points forward? Which is, I think, a working group working together would actually tease those out. Officers come from their own perspective as to trying to get on with the job within a brief. Members as a large feel they need to be satisfied that the risks which they've been asked to undertake are being explained to them.
Yeah, I don't think it's a massive piece of work.
No, I don't think so either. So I think a lot of it is presentation.
Yeah.
It's teasing it in a form which is actually going to be digestible to members.
Yeah, I mean, I would have thought if we sat with the officers, 3 or 4 people from this committee, we could probably do it in an afternoon.
Chairman,
To get the outlines of it, there'll be bits of flesh to fill in.
just on that, and I think there are probably 1, 2, maybe 3 strong themes that come out of this discussion which would underpin that. One of which is governance, which has been mentioned by a number of people in this room tonight. And just on that point, you don't want something over complex because it defeats the point of doing it in the first place. But you need confidence, and also just to reassure, echo what Councillor Martin said. Absolutely, we won't do this unless it's got the correct governance and legal governance in particular in place. But governance is a particularly strong theme that's coming out of this discussion.
Okay. Does the committee agree it would be a good idea to have such a working group? Yeah.
In theory, yes.
In theory. Does that mean you'd like to be a member?
No. I'd love to do it, it's just not feasible.
Okay.
Chairman, the role of this group would be to come forward with recommendations on the governance, on the checks and balances, on the issues that would give members confidence when this thing is up and running and taking decisions.
This group would go through a small risk analysis with the officers and identify those areas together with the officers.
Good.
As Mike said, tease them out.
Good.
Chairman, I've taken the liberty of writing some thoughts down as to what we've agreed. It seems to me that we are looking for some sort of business plan or suitable variant, because there's a bit of a different disagreement, at least between John and me, as to how you define a business plan. I think we need a better definition of investment criteria, options analysis, the style of what a balanced portfolio would be, geographical areas of interest, and I think much more detail in that area. I would quite like, as part of that also, to see 1 or 2 worked examples as to what the analysis would look like for a particular decision. We've got concerns over governance and delegation levels, and what would they be. And I think we've got checks and balances. And then finally, I've written down the regular reporting of what we're doing. Is that 2 times a year? The other thought which occurs to me is the investment advisory group, both the investment advisor and the sort of ongoing shareholder. In other words, is there an advantage to saying, okay, there's an investment advisory group, but there's also a shareholder group. I don't know how many companies Waverley own, but is there a case for saying there's a shareholder?
Peter, I agree with all things that you're saying. I think so. Yes, I do. I think that's the articulation of those is part of that working group's activity.
Yeah, but those are the sorts of ideas that I expected to be seen coming out of it.
And in your absence, we'll ensure that they're recorded.
I'd certainly like to see them before they become.
What I'd like to propose is that we set up such a working group, and really we need 3 volunteers. It could include audit committee, if you wanted to put your hand on the job. I'm looking at you, Stephen. I don't think it's too much work.
No, I'm happy to help.
Okay, Mike?
Okay.
Okay, and I'll try and attend. Okay.
Probably want 3 members of this.
Well, we've got 3 members plus you. Okay. Can we? How are we doing for time?
Time to go home.
Not quite. Another hour. The next item was the performance management report, and Lauren, you're going to have a go at this.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. At the previous meeting of this committee, it was agreed that going forward, performance indicators would be reported on exception basis only. Therefore, this report will only present those KPIs where performance is above or below target by more than 5%, or where those indicators without the target are notable. The graphic trend analysis report was still kept as previously, and it can be found on page 29 under Annex 1. The first quarter has been a very strong performance, shows very strong performance, with only one indicator being off target by more than 5%, and this indicator refers to the overall response rate, which has dropped to 87% due to a few particularly complex level 3 cases, which took over 21 days to resolve. However, all level 1 and level 2 complaints were responded to within the target time scale. The employee sickness levels are at the lowest since the third quarter in 2016 and 17, and the new quarterly target of 1.63 days per employee was introduced starting from first quarter of this year. Also, when compared with other Surrey districts, Waverley has the 4th lowest staff sickness levels in the county, which is very good news. Also, at the previous meeting, the committee also engaged in a discussion on how we could measure the customer satisfaction levels, and there were 3 options which we looked into. The sample used by the Surrey County Council in their telephone resident survey is considered too low for the purpose of measuring customer satisfaction. We are able to use the Council's Your Waverley magazine, which is issued twice a year, but it would come at an extra cost per each run of the magazine. The next citizens panel survey will be conducted this autumn, and the customer service questions can be included in it. However, as the panel has been in existence for the 3 years and has taken part in several surveys, it is felt that the feedback we receive is a little bit less objective than a random sample that would receive from other selected group of residents. The panel will be refreshed next year, so we can try it again. In the recent survey from spring 2017, we asked the panelists to rate the service received on the last occasion on a scale of 1 to 5, with 1 being poor and 5 being excellent. Over 77% of panelists were satisfied with the received service, which remained at the same level since 2015. So I believe that might be the figure that we could use for our baseline as well. As you're probably aware, there is also a customer service review being taken currently by the council, which started last year, and the recommendations are due to come to this committee hopefully in the next cycle as well. The conclusions are likely to include proposals for measuring customer satisfaction in a timely and a service-specific way. So we know how each service area performs and which areas would need improvement going forward. As part of the review, a list of all customer satisfaction surveys currently run by each service area is being gathered for further analysis. For this reason, it is recommended that the committee wait until the report is being completed until taking this matter further. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Just a comment first before I pass it out. We asked, or suggested at the last meeting that we just look at things by exception, but when they were outside the normal range. And I'm a great support, there's no point in looking at things which just are within the range. But building on that, you know, if you're doing that, you also need to, I think, or we need to look at the reasons behind that. You know, if it's an exception, if it's outside that thing, that's why we're looking at it. And therefore, I'd ask members to sort of focus on the comments. My view is that in a number of instances they didn't give the reasons. They were just, I'm not saying excuses, but they were generalised comments on what could be the case. I think if something goes outside, then it needs attention. We need to try and find out what the cause is. Members?
I mean, we've only got 2 non-green ones, and I was going to ask you, do we know why our invoice payment performance hasn't been meeting target?
Sure, I'll answer it. It's a particularly challenging target to meet, to be fair. There's, it sounds like a crazy excuse, but when you think 450 employees here, and we have to circulate invoices around to get approval for payment, it takes time to chase them around sometimes.
How many invoices do we pay a month on average?
A month would be probably about 1,500.
Right, what sort of sizes are they?
It can range from just a few pounds to a quarter of a million.
Right, I mean, is there any sense in, actually this seems to be then a very blunt instrument, and should we not be, if you like, dividing, I mean, if there, is it the big ones which tend to be later, or is it the
No, it tends
small?
to be small, so things like I did an analysis a few meetings back where I actually brought forward what it was, and things like there was a pair of Wellington boots for one of the rangers. He's out in the field. It's, you know, it was about £15 to be honest. But he comes in once or twice a week at the most. He's way out across the borough. It's, you know, he's not desk bound. He's not going to push an invoice. It's not his top priority.
Sorry, in that case, I mean, what he just basically acquired some boots on chickens and sent them to us.
Well, it's all an account. It's,
Right.
so we're invoiced for things. We don't deal with cash in the business.
I mean, how many people have to approve a £15 bill?
Well, so there's just one person between him and the approval, so there's no self. So he'll put the order in, it comes in, he says yes, I've received them, so he receives them. Then it goes off to the next person up, and it gets done.
I'm slightly confused, and I thought that the small ones are ones which you would be able to deal with relatively fast. I mean, I do see it's within 30 days or with the supplier payment terms, are they often less than that?
Sometimes I'm a bit longer.
Well,
But we're saying supplier payment terms.
why don't we put a target of 99% in if we can't actually meet it ever?
Just keeps the pressure on people to pay to get the information flowing.
Okay.
And the second, I mean, I think maybe a simpler answer to this one. I take it that the complaints, the spike in level 3s, are they all due to these increased household planning applications? This is the complaints one, which is red because it's had a sub.
That's what the comment says.
Well, you know, I just wondered, it's good to know.
Chairman, I mean, that was the point I was going to address. Can I just
I
reword it?
was going to address it as well, but
Well, can I
Someone could enlighten me.
reword the question, because that's the one point I honed in on, and my thought process was exactly as you articulated in what we should be worrying about,
Yeah.
i.e. the
Yeah, absolutely.
comments. So I mean, the comments are that it's, you know, the spike in complaints is linked to the increase in the number of household planning applications, and actually assert it's actually linked to a decrease in our ability to satisfy an upward moving number of planning applications, and therefore we need to seek the reason for that, and there seem to be two possible reasons. One might be market conditions, because there seems to be a dropping off in the amount of properties being sold, and therefore a lot more people are doing domestic work which requires planning permission, in which case there's maybe an issue around our staffing levels. The other possible solution is that we've just gone through the local plan exercise and examination and Dunsfold, which will have taken up an awful lot of officer time, in which case it's a blip and it's not a problem. So it'd be interesting to hear which of those two it is. You know, have we got a shortage of staff for the market conditions, or were staff just preoccupied, i.e. no problem?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Let me just add to that. I mean, the number of complaints have increased from 6 to 13. They've more than doubled. I can't believe the number of household applications have more than doubled if there is a complaint percentage per application. Therefore, the point that Stephen is making, that you reach almost a tipping point in your workload and it all starts to go wrong, is probably absolutely right. And it's that sort of analysis that I think is required, or should just jump out of this.
I think sometimes it's very difficult to get the pin down. I think you're absolutely right that I think there's a level beyond which, you know, you've got done for, or you've got the local plan, and it just tips, you know, things have to just get prioritised, and sometimes responding to some of these things just take a second.
Okay.
Can I comment? I mean, I think all this illustrates the commentary needs to reflect these uncertainties. I mean, the questions we're asking, to my mind, actually should be in the commentary.
Yeah.
I mean, and that would make them a lot more revealing. Okay, it may generate further questions, but I think, you know, teasing out the background to why this has happened, I think is as important as reporting it that it has happened. And I think from that you can even then go on to suggest what the corrective action should be, and I think that ultimately is what, as an ONS committee, we're looking for. I mean, what are we doing to fix the problem?
Yeah.
And I think that is what we really, as a committee, would be looking to see, is what recommendations you're making that to actually fix what has gone wrong.
Yeah. It's a management tool. This.
Yeah.
This is a management tool to allow things to happen, not to record, to inform. Yeah. Okay. Peter.
Just going back to page 41 of the percentage of invoices paid, and I think got a lot of sympathy with what the target should be, and do we really want officers running around making sure we get to 99% of a target, which actually may not be productive, and therefore is the target right?
And that should be in the comments.
And I think we should be putting, that's probably a bit silly, and 139 invoices not paid, what's the value of those, and is it really significant? You know, I mean, I think we just need to put a bit of thinking into that.
Okay, thanks very much, Peter. If there are no other comments on it, the other point which you made at the end of your talk about leaving it the feedback for the officers' reports. Are there any comments on that? I personally agree with the recommendation. I thought it was a sensible thing to do. Yep. Okay, thank you very much. Let's move on. We're not doing too bad for time. And the next one, which is the in-depth review capital expenditure, Mike is going to take the lead on because it's his pet subject. And you've got 20 minutes.
No, I'll not take 20 minutes. At our last meeting we said, I think we agreed that we did want to look in more depth at what was going on capital expenditure, and particularly the slippage. So on page 55 in Annex 1, I set out my understanding of what we thought we wanted to do, and I would welcome comments on that. The background to the slippage, I worked with Peter's people and the accountant Rosie dealing with capital expenditure reporting, and I think we have agreed the figures. But if you look on table 1 on page 57, you will see that both on the general fund and on the HRA, around half the total final budget capital expenditure actually was slipped into the subsequent year. Now, that's even more bigger slippage than I even envisaged was going on. So I think there really is an issue here that we need to look at. The figures on table 2 are cumulative, so you can see starting from these are all taken from the budget management reports to the executive in those months. So it starts in September, then through November, and so on. So my first question to members is, have identified what you would like to look at. Alex has translated my one page into what a 7 or 8 page document for monitoring purposes. Some of it I'm sure we will fill in further as we go along, but if there are any comments on that, I would welcome those also, Chairman.
I just thought the first page, yes, was missing. The first bullet point should have been to explain the main reasons why slippage actually happens.
Well,
I'm sure there are very obvious reasons, but
well, I guess investigate. This is what I said out. You read table the Annex 1. My introduction did just that. I think that's why I was asking. Have I got it right?
So I suppose really what I was getting at is what actually causes.
Well, this is what we're going to need to look at.
Exactly.
We've observed it's happening.
Exactly.
So the whole purpose of the scrutiny committee is to get in and discover what the hell's been going on.
Yeah, but
Basically,
I thought that wasn't completely obvious from rationale background to the review, but I entirely agree with you. That's what I would want to see too.
And but my only other comment is on one of the things that Alex has drafted, and suggesting that this wouldn't transgress into audit's area. I actually think it is highly likely that it probably would. And again, Chairman, I would suggest that audit join us in looking at this particular area, because I think it's almost inevitable we're going to go into process to see when we actually explore what has been going on and whether is the process adequate, and is the procedure adequate, and is that process actually being followed as members expect it to be. But I wouldn't want to prejudge what the outcome is, but I do think we are going to transgress into areas of responsibility for audit. It would be advisable to do it all in one go rather than making two bites at it.
I've been advised for matters of scrutiny, the membership of the committee will have to form members of scrutiny, and if it's any audit members, they can come to observe, but they can't be members of the task group.
Okay, well, I mean, we invite them to attend like we did earlier on. I mean, we've established a process for dealing with that, I think, if the chairman and the other members are happy with that arrangement.
Could I ask a question on that? So who's advised? Where's this come from?
So a task and finish group is effectively a subgroup of this overview and scrutiny committee, so therefore it should comprise members and substitute members.
Doesn't overview and scrutiny have the option of bringing in people outside of overview and scrutiny to join their task groups? I thought that was a fundamental part of the ONS.
I believe you can co-opt.
Yep.
You're now co-opted.
They're now co-opted.
I guess the question, Mike, is for the members here tonight is whether this is an appropriate subject for an in-depth review.
If it's better than it should be. You know, we've got numbers over there, we don't have the idea of where they're coming from and why they're happening. So instead of decreasing, it will increase more if we don't put the lid on it. And in short words, put a cork on it and find out what's the spillage going on.
Okay.
It will go higher. If it's a crack, it will go bigger.
It could.
Yeah.
On have we passed on to the next stage, have we? Are we now on scrutiny review? Yeah, okay. I'm just querying the housing revenue account because as far as Oxford Ridge are concerned, because again come a time when the expenditure in building all the council houses then stops, and then we get a revenue stream coming in from the rents. So has that taken into account the switch from one to the other in our housing revenue account?
Yes.
All I can say is that these are the figures reported to the executive month by month. It started off with a programme. There are, I think, special circumstances of HRA which we need to look at. There's the budget, there's the business plan was revised in the year, and to the extent that that impacted on last year's capital expenditure programme and the HRA, I think that we would need to look at. But I could foresee that was one of the reasons. But a surprising thing, you'll notice on both those figures, if you look at the table, and we'll get into detail now, that the big jump happens at the very last moment, after the year end. which is
Yes.
always extraordinary.
Yeah.
I mean, the figures, the outcome reported to the executive in July is significantly different to the outcome reported to the executive in March. So something odd is happening. And I think one of the things that I'm concerned about from this OMS committee's point of view, from value for money and customer service, is that if council has authorised a capital spend, particularly on the general fund, we're not doing our residents any benefit by not spending that capital. I mean, if one programme goes down, and you can understand that, why aren't we able to introduce other programmes as a substitution? And if we can identify the programme slippage early enough, we have a better chance of doing something. But that's for later on. But to my mind, I think there is a problem, and I think it's worthy of scrutiny. But I mean, it's really to other members to have a consensus.
Peter, what's your views?
Yeah, I mean, I think as an old CFO and having many responsibilities for capital budgets, I usually always have a bottle of champagne with the CFO to ensure they spend the capital, to spend the capex, and I invariably win because I think I can only remember 2 occasions when I've paid out on my bottle of champagne because capital expenditure notoriously doesn't spend its money because of lots of good reasons. However, I have to say, with these figures here, general fund of 9.2 million, we actually, even 3 months after any report, 4.7.
Yep.
It's about half, and then on the HRA, it's about half. That's a long way short.
Yep.
So I think, yes, I will always expect only 80-90% at best to be spent, but when it's regular at 50, then I think it's probably
there's something worth investigating.
Yeah, but I mean, I think we shouldn't get. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to condone any thoughts of people running around spending money at the end because they need to get the numbers up.
Well, in my introduction, I did accept there can be reasonable grounds for slippage.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's
the real world, but to this extent.
Yeah, I think it's let's have another. Let's have a look. Maybe it's just being too optimistic all the time.
Yeah.
Perhaps Peter wants to.
Maybe like shedding a bit of light on it. So, reality is the way the capital budget's put together is the whole scheme value goes into the budget to start with. It isn't profiled across 2 or 3 years. So we've got Memorial Hall sitting there at just over £3.2 million. It went in up front, so it gets slipped into the years it's required, which is one way of budgeting. You go through your review, you'll come back with potentially another way. We'll say, okay, we'll take a 3 or 4 year or 5 year view of capital programming and program the money to more or less where it belongs and finance it in a different slightly different way. Just take a different view, that's all it is. So
Chairman, can I just ask you a question specifically on that point? If that's the case, then how do we manage our cash flow and how do we manage our investments of the short-term things? We must have to put a different plan together to determine. So this makes it rather meaningless. I think if you don't have a phased thing, then there's no point even showing the numbers.
it's a fair point. Do your review and come up with your solution.
Chairman, I think it's definitely partly that. I think as well psychologically, when a project manager on a capital scheme that spans a number of years, I think there's a nervousness about having to go back to committee if they've spent more than the allocation for that year to draw down and bring forward the future allocations. And I think we need to change that mindset.
Yeah.
We need to encourage officers to be more realistic up front and then go back for additional money if needed.
Damien, perhaps all these things will come out of this review.
So.
I mean, you make a good point.
Mr. Chairman, there is a culture, and I understand culture being 3 years, but I can't say it's all my culture. So, that the money historically being put out up front because people worry they'll lose it in future years if halfway through a project. If that's not the case, but maybe Councillor Band would comment. He's been involved in that much more than I have. So.
But the consequences of that behaviour in terms of holding liquid money in a liquid form and not being able to maximise the investment of any funds we have is a problem we need to address.
The cash flow forecast is done differently to the physical capital. This is notional on paper.
Right.
But Chairman, I mean, on the other side, there are plenty of short-term capital expenditure programmes which are being postponed year on year out because there is ostensibly no budget for them. Demonstrably, there is a budget for them. And there ought to be, certainly in my view, a process where, if certainly legitimately capital projects slip, there ought to be a mechanism for bringing forward some of the programmes which have been postponed to subsequent years. And I think this flexibility would do a lot for our residents. I mean, small capital expenditure programmes in towns and villages, you know, have a benefit to residents out of all proportion to the money's allocations. And very often they have small programmes which are being delayed and delayed and delayed because they're being overtaken by larger, a little bit more expensive programmes. So being able to introduce small programmes within the year has a major benefit to our residents. And I think we need to try and find a process that actually enables that to happen more readily than it is at the moment. Peter's right, you'll never stop slippage. I mean, but you want to be able to manage it a little bit better than we've got to.
It seems to me, Chairman, that what we need is a gross and a gross thing. It's okay, there's 3 projects, 5 million, 4 million, 3 million.
Yes.
And actually the 5 million is already spent the first year, the 4 million is going to be spent the second, third and fourth year, the 3 million is going to be spent equally. I mean, you know, and then if it's wrong a little bit and somebody comes in, I've got to spend it a bit early, he's got the permission because he's got the gross, it's just a matter of, you know, adjusting.
Peter, I think we need to be on the in-depth review after. Is there anyone who doesn't agree that this shouldn't be an in-depth review?
Well, it depends how you define in-depth, but I mean, at least it requires a bit of attention.
There is a subject to be addressed.
Yeah.
The amount of effort that it takes is dependent upon what's said. John?
I think one of the things that I hear here, and it does affect the audit, is that we've got a process defect. I mean, I'm always used to things like capital approvals, which are, and don't go into the financial figures because capital approvals are really a balance sheet item, it's a commitment. And then you've got capital expenditure. And it's capital expenditure that you budget for, not necessarily capital approvals.
You've got the future liability,
Yes.
but here's the actual spend.
Yes. So what you have is you have a pot of capital expenditure, and that's earmarked. And then you have the sort of approvals levels up there, and in order to get more headroom, you might have to reappraise your capital approval,
Yes.
and then basically say, well, I'm not going to use all of that, but I can put it. So it still keeps the culture we've got to now. We get the capital approvals done up front in total, but we actually forecast the expenditure. It would be interesting if you, before you started this review, if Peter could actually produce those figures.
Because they actually must exist, otherwise
Well,
they
they
must
must,
get the investment.
Exactly. If we're all in agreement that this is a reasonable subject for an in-depth review, right, have you spoken to anyone whether they'd like to participate in this? Don't all put your hands up at once.
Chairman, just before we commit to yet another little group, I mean, it seems to me that it ought to be fairly easily addressed. I mean, we've heard the concerns of the committee. Why don't we have somebody come back and say, okay, we've thought about this, and this is a proposal.
Chairman, can I comment? I have to come clean. I have changed the system this year already. We're moving over with the update in Aggresso. We have the planner module that's coming live. Literally, the planner one's live now. We've got some other updates coming live. The whole suite in December. But part of the budget process for capital is exactly as Councillor Gray and Councillor Martin were saying. So we've changed it so we're looking at the whole pot, what the complete approval is, and it's phased over the years, so we can see a much more structured approach to the overall capital programme rather than just the discrete year on year, what are we doing in terms of overall value, which isn't helpful when you start looking at slippage. So it has changed. The support behind every individual project's changed. We've heard what Councillor Band said several months ago about, quite a few months ago actually, about the availability of the smaller pots of money to be recycled. That's coming into play as well. So there is a process already agreed with the councils to move forward.
I mean, the issue I would have, I mean, it may not necessarily just be a financial activity. I mean, project management, the delivery of things like this are dependent upon a whole series of people doing things. And I would have hoped that such a working group would actually investigate some of those things that either control or ensure that a job gets done, long before it hits the sunk cost. I mean, it's not a massaging exercise with with the financial elements, it's the actual project management itself.
Chairman, every single aspect of every single capital bit of spend we have, it will be on a template that covers the procurement, the timing, phasing, project management, the whole lot, cash flow, for every single project we have in the capital programme. That's how it will be built up going forward.
Okay, Mike.
Well, from my, well, it's good to hear what Peter's talking about, but from my past experience, I think it would take a while for 2 or 3 of us to tease out what actually has been happening. I think this is a huge committee round this table, and it would be an inordinate amount of time trying to do this with the number of people around this table. I think it would be easier and more comfortable, let's say, for officers also to explain to us in detail what is happening if we do it outside this meeting. I have some suspicions because in the past, in the previous incarnation, I sat in on project review meetings, and I have some concerns of things that I saw then have still been happening and have got worse. For example, resource planning, I think, has been a major factor in our inability to actually progress some of our capital projects. But, you know, I don't want to prejudge what we're going to find, but I suspect we do need to sit down in detail and look at some case histories and really go through them month by month and see what actually happened. And you know, look at what should happen today with the new system and satisfy ourselves that the new system will actually address the historic issues. I think what, to my mind, it's not such much an exercise as criticising what's happened in the past. It's trying to find a way of ensuring the new system actually will deliver what we expect it to deliver, and almost doing a check to satisfy ourselves that that's actually what is going to happen.
Chairman, it does sound like a really good opportunity where Peter has this new system, these new arrangements, almost a fundamental change in the way that we do it. And given Councillor Band's experience and perspective, maybe an opportunity for Councillor Band to work with Peter to pull together a report that comes back to the committee that sets out how this new arrangement will work, and I think gives confidence that the issues that we've experienced in the past have actually been addressed. Because you're quite right that changing a financial system on its own doesn't necessarily change behaviours and policy arrangements and the psychology of it. But if Councillor Band is able to input into the report, that would be helpful.
Thanks for the suggestion, Damien. As much confidence as I've got in Councillor Band.
Somebody else needs to do that.
One person looking over somebody else's shoulder, in my experience, doesn't work that well. You need several people to sort of bang ideas against each other and to spark off each other. It doesn't need to be a large group. It doesn't need to go on forever. It's a relatively simple exercise. I think quite a professional job could be done under Councillor Band's leadership. I would suggest we need 3 people to do it. I'm happy to put my bit in.
Chair, I'm going to suggest, given that a significant amount of this report, underspend originates from the housing revenue account, could the housing ONS committee be canvassed to see if there's a volunteer to participate, because they will know the foibles of spend in that area.
Quite a good idea. Yep, good idea. Okay.
A meeting next week. So
Yes. Yeah. Okay.
And audit.
And audit as well. I mean, John's already been co-opted.
What's the difference, Chairman, between having an internal audit of this and what we're trying to do? Where does the one stop and the other begin?
Right, I think it's blurred, but I think I was approaching it from the value for money perspective. Is were our residents getting value for money from the capital expenditure programme?
Thank you.
Because of this slippage. But I think it will stray into audit areas almost inevitably.
I think we do. I think we're lucky here that we've got Councillor Seaborn, who in fact is an audit member as well. So in that respect, as long as we say that can be discussed, that probably covers it. And Mike, you also are, so we're well represented in that respect. But I think that we're still exploring this issue the new terms of reference between ONS and Orbit.
Okay, thanks very much. Can we, we've got 26 minutes, if we could, do we?
Chairman, can I just make one quick comment about the pro forma that's in front of us? It has a timetable, and the timetable has a completion date, which seems to me a little bit vague, just on the bitter experience of having participated in 2 fairly substantial reviews in the last 12 months. The critical point is when it goes to executive, I think when it's presented to executive, and from finishing the internal work to getting a report, to getting it reviewed by this committee and then presented to executive could frequently take 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah.
So it would be good to actually see on the pro forma the target executive date, because that will focus everyone's mind about how much time is really available.
Okay, good point.
And Chairman, can I ask Alex to look at some dates
Yes.
so we can start getting together which would suit both officers and members?
Do we need to sort of have a formal motion on this, or is it?
I don't think so, as long as
No, okay,
members
go.
agree the...
Okay, then let's move on to the general fund budget.
Chairman, sorry, on that point, presumably the other group will also be getting some dates organised soon.
Yes. Peter.
Thank you, Chairman. So, general fund budget overview for 17-18. The report's looking to this committee to review specifically the issues around the budget shortfall. So in July we took a medium-term plan that was revised to the executive, and within that there was a list of actions that are proposed to help address the budget shortfall, which I've reproduced in the report. So the committee's asked if they like to put some priorities to those actions and discuss the merits of what they are. We also consider setting up a subgroup or subgroups of this committee to look at a couple of specific issues, and I'm suggesting here income generation is quite a strong one, and also our staffing costs, which is pushing about £14 million, how we can better utilise make use of the staffing costs going forward over the medium-term plan to make sure we're getting the best value for money there. There's around about 450 staff, cost us 14 million. There has to be some impact there, looking at addressing the issues, bearing in mind we potentially deliver most of our service to people, to keep the base service running the council. So finally, there's also a timetable. It takes us right through till February 18, so it's effectively a year and a half away in terms of the key milestones within setting budget and sorting out the medium-term plan implementation. Within that itself, I've deliberately put a whole year in from January to December for us to cost into the budget any of the corporate plan creators type activities that will come out of that, because it will take a period of time to do any form of discussion, negotiation, agreement before we can get into physically costing into the budget in a realistic way to affect bottom line. So, to you, Chairman.
Thanks very much, Peter. Before we go into the specifics from the member, I'm going to ask Mike for some general comments, which you expressed to me earlier, and I think it might be a sort of valuable starter.
Okay. But it seems to me that this report highlights the problem very clearly. But it doesn't seem to me it necessarily points the way to a solution. I mean, inevitably, the individual annual budgets need to fit into the development of the corporate plan and then medium-term financial strategy. And from my perspective, it does seem to me that some radical changes will need to be made to our medium-term financial strategy to enable us to deal with these projected shortfalls. And from my perspective, the biggest contribution that this O&S committee could make is actually commenting on and critically reviewing the longer term, the medium to longer term financial strategy in which the context of these budgets are set. Because it seems again to me, unless we radically change some of the things which we have been currently and historically doing, we're going to have extreme difficulty in actually meeting these shortfalls. We've been on cost reduction exercises for goodness knows how many years now, and there's clearly a limit as to what we can do by continuing this sort of slicing process. And it will need some radical rethink as to how we deliver some of the services, or a radical rethink as to do we actually deliver all of the services we've historically done if we're going to actually make the budgets balanced. And it also seems to me that we're unlikely to achieve all of this within one budget year. So although this paper is specifically about next year's budget, the preparation for next year's budget, it ought to be seen in a context for the longer term financial strategy. And without that, it's difficult to comment on the individual bits. I mean, they need to be gone through, but the actual funding from central government, for example, we're never going to know really probably until January, if we're lucky. So the best will in the world, ploughing through these things in isolation, will only take us so far, and we can comment till we're blue in the face, but it won't necessarily help you finalise a budget. But much more important, to my mind, is actually agreeing the medium to long term financial strategy in which this budget is set.
Chairman, I think we can take the numbers as fairly reasonable in terms of as they're presented over the 3 years, with a fairly good degree of certainty. Okay, with the RSG question, the 800, okay, it's a bonus if it doesn't happen. The reality is the government saying it is. But those are the numbers. So the point of this report now is there's on page 60. There is a list there, key actions to address the budget shortfall. And it's not all about budget cuts. So we've had a very good debate tonight about the company and the investment. So it's about income generation, it's about working in partnership. There's a whole raft of things this council can do. Some of it was brought forward through the Creators report, saying we need to look slightly wider than we have in the past, in different territory now. And this is where we're saying, okay, here's a whole list of key actions, open to the committee to review and prioritise in terms of which one of those do they think the council should focus on the most. So the company's in there as one item. Cost cutting is, as Councillor Ban says, not that effective really at balancing this kind of budget problem going forward. Been in that territory, we've dealt with it, we've had what we can in terms of cost cutting. It's looking at the world differently. And so these are actions saying, these are the pragmatic things we can do as a council to try and address in the longer term what we consider the budget shortfall to be. Next year we have a legal responsibility, we've got to set a budget, a balanced budget. But the reality is we've got to look longer than 1 year. Probably got to look at 3 to 5 years in reality, because as Councillor Ban says, delivering change on that scale takes time.
Sure.
There's a lead in time, and there's a cost to doing it.
Yeah.
And we have to reflect that.
That's right. That's right. Exactly.
Chairman, could I just mention, and Damien may want to echo this, you may be aware that there is work going on with the executive in some fundamental looking at how the council goes forward from here. What sort of council we're going to be. I don't know whether you want to say a bit more about that, but this is crucial to the debate in terms of the budget, because we can't carry on as we've been carrying on. So,
and Chairman, just to reinforce that and really build on what Councillor Banda says, we've achieved a lot over a number of years by following a particular approach to our budget and resources, and it's been relatively effective, and it's enabled the council to achieve a lot of things. But it's absolutely fair to say that in order to cope with the challenges ahead, the council is going to have to think more radically. It's going to have to consider things that it hasn't considered before, and those are things that will not deliver savings within a relatively short time frame. They are going to be things that will be delivered over the medium term. One of the things the executive are very keen to do over the coming months is to put together a new council strategy to help set out at a very high level the direction that they wish to take the council forward in. Some of those will be opportunities to have a more positive impact on local communities, to achieve more, but some of it, quite rightly, will also be about how to make sure that over time the council will be able to sustain the level of activity that it wants to sustain to deliver its priorities, which will be about the things that Peter mentioned, new income generation schemes, new investment opportunities, and potentially new relationships with other organisations, whether we're contracting or partnering or buying or selling from colleagues from across the county and elsewhere. And I think all of those things will need to be in the frame.
I think it's that strategy that Mike was saying, that as a scrutiny function, we could, and would like to challenge and contribute to it, yes.
Just looking at waste fund reduction from Surrey County Council, I was under the impression from Jed that in fact it was sliced over 4 years, 200, 200, 200 and 200, and not 300, 300 and 200.
It's 3 years. And the final position is not known, but we're currently in discussions with Surrey that we're looking at it being phased over 3 years with the greatest cut to Waverley's funding in the first year. So it's weighted to the biggest reduction up front. But we're still in discussion, so it's not a final position.
Right. Sorry. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. In terms of what in my business experience we used to call managing the base, earlier in the year I participated in a review of the management of our leisure centres, and when we White Ramsdale and I presented that to executive, the key finding was that we didn't actually have a policy, a current policy, for the management of what was quite a large discretionary service, generating quite a significant amount of income this year. I mean, it's a contract that sometimes will generate income, sometimes won't. The point was there's no policy setting out whether we actually intend to make money out of it or not. Which leads me to wonder, have we got other discretionary services that are requiring material amounts of financial input or have the potential to generate material amounts of revenue? And I wonder, the question to us is, can we identify things that members can do? I wonder if the committee recommending to the executive that where an executive member has accountability for a discretionary service that doesn't have a current policy, our whole business would be better managed if we did actually have a current policy setting out where the funding is going to come from and the potential for generating revenue if it exists. I think that's just good housekeeping, but Mike's made the point that we may have to get rid of stuff. If you don't have a policy to say why it's there and what it's going to deliver and why it's going to be delivered, then on pretty shaky grounds. So I think as a good piece of housekeeping, that might be something that this committee might want to consider recommending to the executive.
Okay. Any comments on that?
Agreed. Yeah.
When I looked at this list at first, I'm really pleased, Peter, that you mentioned the £14 million, because the one thing that absolutely, and I've said this before, that jumped out at me of the key financial plan actions to address budget shortfall was there was absolutely no mention in that of the salary figure. Now, if you're running a factory and you employed, you had 450 people working in it, and you had a certain throughput, and you were running out of money, there's several things you could do. I mean, first thing you try and do is to increase the throughput. You try and reduce those overheads per unit. Pretty difficult for a council, unless of course you're talking about partnering and spreading that work, increasing the throughput. But I find it really difficult to look at these as individual items without looking at it in its entirety. I just feel as though I'm picking over the bones and that the animal itself is sort of dying. Somehow we've got to get a hold of the totality of it, understand where it's going, see whether it's going in the right direction, whether the totality is right. And if it is, then you can play around with it. I just really struggled trying to get to grips with the individual items when you know that if we continue as we're doing, we're going to end up bankrupt. I mean, you close the factory. I mean, it's quite simple.
You have to reduce the size of the factory first before you close it down. I mean, yes, the unfortunate truth is that having for years, I joined the council in 2007, we never thought we would be gutted services, but the discretionary services now clearly have to be looked at, because if we don't have the income, we aren't allowed to put up council tax by more than a certain amount a year. Either, and this is where take advice, a balanced budget means that your income and your expenditure is actually balanced. You can't use reserves to make up the shortfall.
Well, we could in 1 year, but it's a short-term strategy.
So basically, certainly over a 3-year period, that's 2 years to the next election and the year afterwards, this council is going to have to make some very difficult decisions unless something magically happens at the layer of central government, which is probably unlikely. On a slightly lighter note, I don't know who drafted the second bullet point, but could someone please translate it for me? Cost-cutting foresight efficiency programme to identify future schemes, including system linking projects. Sorry, what is that getting at?
I might be able to help. And it really starts with what Councillor Band said earlier, and Councillor Seaborn. There's a lot of things that we do in the council, but we don't always do them with a focus on generating savings, income or efficiencies. We run care line services to support people in the community who are vulnerable. We run a family support service to help families get back on their feet. We run a Waverley training services to help young people access the employment market. But those are also activities that over time we've seen potentially significant reductions in funding, some reductions from Surrey County Council and elsewhere. And those functions have become much more commercially minded as time has moved on, to the point where most of those services are now starting to generate income and would not necessarily be things we want to cut. What we haven't done, Councillor Seaborn's point, is that we haven't explicitly set out what those services are there to achieve. We've kind of evolved our thinking over time and they've headed in roughly the same direction. And I think what we need to do, particularly if you want to look at discretionary services, is see what the opportunities are for the council to, in some cases, grow those services, in some cases employ more staff, if there is a business case that then generates significant income that more than compensates for those costs.
Sorry, what does cross-cutting foresight efficiency programme mean?
Specifically on that one, there's a programme which is run across the council called Foresight, which looks at a number of different opportunities to review services. So an example is that there is a process review happening in housing benefits nearing completion, which is a pilot of a process that we'd like to roll out across the council, looking at mapping the customer journey and looking at opportunities to make pretty radical improvements in customer satisfaction and, in this case, efficiency savings. And it's about taking that methodology and using it much more systematically to drive out savings as well as improvements.
So the term cross-cutting, does that mean cost-cutting or cross-cutting?
It means a lot of the Foresight projects operate across all services. So, for example, we remodelled the way that staff use the office accommodation to free up space that we now rent to adult social care and the police and others as an income generating method, but it impacted on every service in the council.
Thank you.
Coming back, Peter, to the point that you made at the end of your presentation about the possibility of another working group. What are members' views on that?
I suppose the question I have, is the executive actually leading on this? And this is the biggest strategic decision this council has taken in a decade. But I think this committee could
have a role. I think we ought to see what the executive want it to be, how they want to handle it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, there needs to be a clear strategy, and then perhaps we can review that. But we shouldn't be involved in generating that strategy, and I don't think we're the right people to do it anyway.
Yes.
Peter.
I see this on an even bigger scale at Surrey County Council, and all the easy decisions over the last 7 years have been made, and we've gone through the fat, gone through the muscle, and now we're going well into bone, and I suspect we're in the same sort of area here. I think it's sensible for each of the scrutiny committees to make some suggestions and proposals, but it's pretty tough doing that. Clearly the main thrust has to come from the executive, but I mean they're looking for ideas from everybody, including us. I don't have any magical ideas, sadly. I think two things that occur to me: the business rates new system. There is an opportunity to apply for a pilot by the end of this month, and that's, I think, all of the Surrey local authorities led by the county will propose and go ahead with that. This is the thing which we were trying to get permission for at the beginning of this year, when we got an assurance from the government, unofficial assurance, call it what's a little bit smoke and mirrory, that we would be included in a pilot beginning the 1st of April next year, 2018. That seemed to go off the agenda 2 or 3 months ago during the course of the election, general election that is, and now it's back on again and we're being asked to apply. So with a bit of luck we'll get into the pilot, and hopefully that will provide some benefit, but we don't know whether it will or not. So I think that's one area which may be a salvation, and certainly from a county point of view the extra funding could be very substantial. And I think the other thing is on a political level, quite apart from the sort of the financial stuff that we look at, I think the most shocking thing in the whole of this is the negative government grant, the negative RSG. We absolutely have to keep going with the political campaign to saying, up with this, we will not put. Certainly when I put this to the MPs, they all say, yeah, we're never going to agree to that. But actually, they haven't done anything to get that reversed. So there's a lot of nodding of heads and saying, isn't that terrible? And it does seem to be Surrey, as uniquely in the country, the victims of this. And it's simply preposterous. There is a big political push that we need to make to say, and to get this across to people, if the maximum we can put up council tax is 3%, 2%, isn't it? And that generates 260,000, isn't it? Is that right?
2%.
So we're being asked to increase, in 1919, we're being asked to increase by 6% effectively to pay for the negative RSG, which is preposterous, or make the savings to go with that. That is simply outrageous, and the money is not to help the people of Surrey, or the people of Waverley in this case, it's to send it back to the Exchequer. It's simply outrageous, and I think we're all beholden, we're all required to get behind a political push to stop that happening. So those are my 2 comments.
Thank you. Any other comments? Nick?
Has anybody considered, I know that Godalming have been very successful in raising money for themselves to build the William Wilfred Noyes Centre, and they're making a profit out of it. Has anybody considered perhaps allowing the main towns to raise money themselves out of projects of their own, and therefore reducing the dependence on Waverley Borough Council to provide grants? I mean, it seems that could be a way forward.
I can only tell you, as a Farnham Town Councillor, I've discussed the possibility of trying to raise funds to, which would in fact, or could potentially alleviate the spend from Waverley. I look forward to the SIL activity, because I think that would generate sizable funds for the towns.
Peter, what's the comeback?
I'm very conscious of the time. Peter, if it's quick.
Just picking up Councillor Holder's comment, there is the possibility of doing a local lottery, which obviously there's a bit of competition with the town council, but the opportunity through the lottery is that we could switch out the funding that we pay to the voluntary grants from the lottery money, which saves the council the 750,000 if it was that successful. Any degree along that scale would be useful. That allows us to switch out the income from the lottery, because it has to go to good cause and charity. We would then fund the voluntary sector, meaning that the council's money.
Chairman, I was thinking that Peter might have said that the town and parish councils have greater freedom over the level of precepts, the council tax contribution that they ask for, because they're not capped in the same way that the district and council is.
Well, there is a cap, but that's not big money. I mean, you need larger amounts of money than that.
But you also have to remember, Chairman, that sort of a very significant portion of Waverley's residents lives in the villages, where the size of the parish council precepts is relatively small,
Yes.
and to make significant changes to that is,
Yep.
you know, it's just not long.
Yep. Okay, if we've no other comments, we've got 2 minutes, and the last item is the forward work programme. Mike and I have gone through it. We've taken quite a number of items out. I would encourage you to look at it, and if you haven't got any items that you think might be appropriate for forward work programmes this evening, have a look at it whilst you're having supper in the bath or whatever. And see if there's any particular things which you're of interest, that is of interest to you.
Or to
and then we
remove.
can consider it.
Or to remove.
Or to remove. Well, please feel free. All suggestions, positive and negative, will be greatly appreciated. So if there are no other comments, I think the meeting's finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
For the second.
Yeah.